Welcome to episode 173 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/173.
Welcome to Real Health Radio. Health advice that's more than just about how you look. And here's your host, Chris Sandel.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. So as I'm recording the intro to this podcast, I've just gone through all the applications for the new practitioner position, and I'm recording this a couple of weeks before this episode's going to go out. So by the time you're hearing this, the interview process should be over and we'll have a new practitioner at 7 Health. But I just want to mention how flawed I've been with the responses, both in terms of the number of people who apply, but also the quality of applications, people with huge amounts of experience and really solid training. And I didn't really know what to expect when I first advertised the position. I knew that I wanted to find the right person, and that if I didn't get the right kind of applicants, I wasn't going to just fill the role for the sake of doing it. But to say that I'm pleasantly surprised is a huge understatement. So I'm hoping in a couple of weeks I'll have someone else who's able to help share the workload with seeing clients. And if you shared the job spec with anyone, I just want to say thank you so much for doing so. Like many of the applicants who applied started their email by saying that they had been forwarded the job spec by a friend or a colleague. So it's wonderful to know the power of this podcast and asking for help from the masses. So yeah, thank you for all that. So this week on the podcast, I'm chatting with Alan Flanagan. So Alan is currently pursuing his PhD in nutrition at the University of Surrey, having completed a master's in nutritional science at the same institution. Originally a lawyer by background in Dublin, Ireland, Alan combines an investigative and logical approach to nutrition together with advocacy skills to communicate the often complicated world of nutrition science, and is dedicated to guiding healthcare professionals and the lay public in science-based nutrition. So I've only fairly recently become aware of Alan. So someone, and I'm not sure who, recommended that I check out the Cut Through Nutrition podcast. And it was launched in June of this year and is co-hosted by Alan and Dr. Joshua Woolrich. And I think there's 6 episodes in season 1, and I must have listened to them in a matter of days when I found it. And this episode is probably a little different to the focus of most of my shows these days. So Real Health Radio, when it first started out, was a lot more focused on nutritional science, but over the last couple of years, there's been much more of a push or a focus on eating disorders and disordered eating and recovery. Except maybe for some of the more recent second edition episodes, nutrition science just doesn't feature as heavily as it used to. And I know on some of the recent episodes as well, I think I mentioned it with Marcy Evans and with Tracy Brown, that I actually spend a lot less time reading about this as a topic. And while that is true, it definitely hasn't lost an interest. Like it's something I'm still very passionate about and interested in. And so that's what this episode is more about, like looking at the state of nutritional science. And so we hit on understanding research, so topics like the hierarchy of scientific evidence, the difference between biomedical science and nutritional science, the problem of meta-analyses and systematic reviews in nutritional science, and the importance of observational studies in nutrition, and what it means to be evidence-based. And then we chat about public health nutrition and the challenges that it faces. And Alan does a really fantastic job here talking about this, because he's got a very good skill of being able to see multiple perspectives at once and the strengths and weaknesses of different views. And while I think we all have biases, at least Alan's biases seem to have taken in many points of view, and he seems very objective and level-headed in his assessment. And so I thoroughly enjoyed this episode, and even when we stopped recording, Alan and I continued chatting for quite a long time afterwards. And as I said, this is a little bit of a detour from what the podcast is often covering, but no less important, and is a great antidote for the hyperbole and the nonsense that is often circulating in the nutrition health world. Alan does enjoy an expletive, so there is some swearing in this one, just so you know. But let's get on with the show. Here is my conversation with Alan Flanagan. Hey, Alan, thanks for coming on the show today.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for having me on.
So I'm a big fan of your podcast, Cut Through Nutrition.
Thanks.
I think that's how I found you. So a podcast that you do with Joshua Woolrich.
Yeah.
And you've done a really great job in the first season, so I'm looking forward to whatever comes up in season 2.
Second season, we've actually just brainstormed over some pizza and wine last week. Our goal with the first season was to very much kind of have a broad introduction, but really talk through like some of the more specific issues of why we've such a fractured discourse in nutrition right now.
Yeah.
And then, but we do want it to be a kind of resource for practitioners in the healthcare space generally, to kind of have something that they can be like, well, I'm really confused about all this screaming about fat and heart disease or sugar and diabetes. Where can I go? So what we're doing with the subsequent seasons is focusing on a specific health condition. So the season 2 is going to be heart disease, cardiovascular coronary heart disease. And we're going to go right the way back to like the 1950s, the historical context, because there's a lot of narratives around that in terms of, oh, fat was demonized mistakenly. And then you go back to the 50s research and you're like, this was really, really persuasive evidence. And then we're just basically going to go through all of the various kind of parameters of nutritional determinants of heart disease, and also, nutritional determinants of lowering heart disease risk. So we're looking forward to it. We'll get recording in the next couple of weeks, and we should have episodes out this side of Christmas.
Awesome. Well, that's really good to hear. So I think a lot of today's conversation is going to be probably ideas that you touched on as part of that first season. I think topics around like nutrition research and understanding research and public health nutrition and socioeconomics and kind of the intersection between those two. But I guess as a starting place, so do you want to give listeners a bit of background on yourself? You're a lawyer / nutritionist, which is an unusual combination.
Well, former lawyer. I have a bit of a bizarre background. So I wanted to be a lawyer coming out of school, but I wasn't entirely sold on it. So I majored in history and English, history and classics and English. And then I did law. And then I started practice in 2009. I was at that for about 9 years, but I had this real passion for nutrition in the background. I think maybe being a lawyer, I was kind of drawn to how can I find out facts. So I started delving into PubMed and becoming one of those annoying citizen scientists, and eventually realized there's a limit to self-learning in any discipline. And I started a master's program at the University of Surrey, where thankfully they unofficially keep a few spaces for people from non-biosciences kind of undergrads. So I got in, and it just really was this accelerated curve that made me kind of fall more in love with the science and the learning process, and wanted to get into research. Law is always kind of there. So I left law last year and committed full-time to a PhD, still at the same university. So very grateful to Surrey for giving a random lawyer from Dublin an opportunity to pursue what has now become my kind of real passion.
Yeah. And so where are you with the PhD? Is that how much longer have you got?
Yeah, I'm finishing my first year now. So 2 more years to go. We did a controlled trial this year. I'm looking at what's known as chrononutrition. So a bit of an overlap between chronobiology. So timing, biological timing and food intake, and how when we eat during the day, or how we distribute energy influences health. So.
Okay. And is that connected with sleep as well, or is it's more just timing?
It's more, sleep is a part of our overall kind of 24-hour circadian rhythm. So the circadian kind of the etymology of it is around the day. So these are internal biological rhythms that run around 24 hours. Humans, they're slightly longer. So we have external cues like our exposure to light during the day or when we eat helps sync those rhythms to the actual 24-hour clock. So sleep obviously is 8 hours, give or take, out of our 20. It's a third of our day. It is an important part of it. I'm not looking at sleep specifically,
okay,
but I am looking at things like social jet lag, which is the difference between how long someone sleeps during the week when an alarm forces them out of bed versus how long they would sleep on their free days when they're able to kind of go to bed and wake on their own kind of internal rhythms. And there's some research suggesting that like the more that you have a disconnect between your internal, some people are later kind of types, evening types. And if you are an evening type, you're more prone to this disconnect because school start times, work start times don't tend to take into account that you're an evening type, unfortunately. So we're looking more at like how people eat across the day and how that influences their health.
Yeah, I've seen recommendations around like for school kids, especially as they're teenagers, that actually the school day should start more like at 10 a.m. or 11 a.m. because just
100%.
That's where they should be waking up later and
yeah. So teenagers from about 12 to 20-ish, give or take, will have what's known as a phase delay. So their internal rhythms delay somewhat. And how we know that is what's called their midpoint of sleep. So your midpoint of sleep is the midpoint between when you would naturally go to sleep and when you would naturally wake. So if we took a bunch of kids and didn't force them awake, you know, the whole on weekends, and people are like, oh, lazy teenagers. It's like, no, they really just do sleep till 9 to 10 a.m. because they have this delay and their midpoint of sleep won't be until maybe 6 in the morning. Whereas we're waking them up at 5, 6. So we're literally dragging them out of bed. And there's been a couple of really cool studies, pilot studies in schools that delayed the start time. And the difference in test scores was pretty night and day. So I think as a society, we've tended to have our structures dictated by virtue of the Industrial Revolution. And now that we're in the technological revolution, I think we really need to start thinking about how we structure and organize our time so that we can kind of better serve people's health. Some companies now, you know, the kind of cool millennial style companies like Facebook and Google or whatever, are letting people work to their own kind of preferences, so to speak.
Yeah. Although they're normally working people into the ground. So
well,
it's winning in one way and losing in another.
We're still going to drag 70 hours out of you a week.
Yeah. I'm reading Matthew Walker's Why We Sleep book at the moment, which is, really fascinating.
It is. I think he did an amazing job of, a lot of scientists are poor communicators, I guess, to the lay public. For such an incredibly distinguished scientist, he did an amazing job with that book of making it really accessible, and his use of analogies was excellent. The one criticism I would have about it, and this is probably where his purely academic side came through, is in terms of practical advice, it was about as useful as a shit-flavored lollipop. It was basically like, sleep, do what I say, or you'll die. Cut out caffeine, cut out wine, never stay up. Like, you know, it was so, like, it was very didactic and it was very impractical, I think. You know, no one's giving up coffee, no one's giving up wine. You know, so stop telling us we're going to die unless we do this stuff.
Yeah, well, I haven't got that far into it to get to his real recommendations. So I will, I'll see what happens when I get there. So, I mean, you talked about initially being a lawyer and then transitioning out. So, I mean, what about you growing up? Was food a really big part of your, of an interest, or big in your household?
I mean, in my household, insofar as I'm Irish and the famine was only 190 years ago, so we have to literally cultural legacies of food are quite interesting. When you, so no, I mean, I grew up in a very normal household food wise, but it was very much like, you know, starving kids in Africa eat everything in front of you. But if you're, you know, and that's the other legacy of, like, you know, what we call Irish mammy syndrome, where you're just like, no matter how long you've been away for, they're just convinced you haven't eaten since the last time they saw you. So no, but it's great. It makes Christmas time quite wonderful, actually. Yep. But no, in terms of my interest, I think sprouted more personally. I was always highly involved in sports growing up, rugby in particular. I got quite interested in my own kind of training and nutrition as an adjuvant to that, and got quite interested in it at kind of 15, 16. Thought it would, help perform better, all that kind of stuff. And that was, I think, where the interest started, was very much just more personal. But around 2009, 2010, there was just this general, that was the blog revolution, right? Where Gary Vaynerchuk was telling everyone they could be a millionaire just by starting a blog.
Just got to hustle.
Right, that's it. Just hustle, even if, Care Bears are your thing. It's like, no, no one's buying Care Bears. So there was this whole blogosphere revolution of nutrition, and mostly it was not academics. Obviously, it was bros, or it was, the paleo kind of revolution was really happening at that time. So I suddenly had all of this access to learning, quote unquote learning. Probably the only website that I really found and relied on for this person is really committed to science was Martin Birkin, who founded Lean Gains. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, I know him.
Yeah. So Martin Birkin was to me kind of one of the first people who was really game changing, pun, in terms of, no one was intermittent fasting then. No one was writing science-based information either, and he would break down studies, and I was like, wow, this is really interesting. And I think in a big way, he got me more appreciative of the scientific approach. And that's where I started kind of because I was getting so much conflicting information, I think my inclination maybe with as a lawyer was, how can I reconcile this? Where do I go? So I started going directly to scientific research myself. But of course, I had no idea what I was doing. And nutrition science is something that is very underappreciated for being unique. It's just conflated as a sub-branch of biomedical biosciences, and it's absolutely not in many respects. And there are really fundamental differences between investigating food as a subject of inquiry and investigating drugs and single compound interventions and surgeries. And a lot of the confusion in nutrition science actually arises because that whole model, the biomedical scientific model, is just superimposed onto nutrition, and everyone expects to get the same answers as you would if you were studying a drug. And of course, we don't get those answers. And then everyone goes, see, nutrition science is bullshit and we can't trust it. And it's like, well, no, you were just asking the wrong questions in the first place. And in science, if you ask the wrong questions, you won't get the right answers. So that was kind of how I gravitated to it. And then I had amassed kind of 5 years really of self-learning, but in a very abstract sense. I knew a lot of facts about nutrition. I could tell you that EPA was a 20 carbon polyunsaturated fatty acid. I had no idea what that meant biologically, and I certainly had no idea how to critically appraise a research paper that used EPA, for example. And I've always had a huge value, and one thing I guess that I did have a in-home culture of in my family was a huge value on education, and that there was never a limit to education and the value in it. And so that was where I immediately, once I realized that was where my self-learning was at, I was like, I need to do something formal with this and see where it goes. And that was the process that started me towards the master's, and now here I am.
Okay. So, I mean, you touched there on the difference between biomedical and nutritional sciences. So, why don't we just start here? Because I think this is a really good place. Because I think there's so much of this mantra at the moment of like, just do your research.
Right.
And my hunch with that is like, that's a good advice on the surface, but is not really great advice, because there's a real art and skill to being able to understand research.
100%. And this whole culture now of, quote, woke and you get told by an anti-vaxxer in an online conversation to educate yourself. And you're like, really? This is the pot calling the kettle black. And we have this culture right now where, we have an anti-intellectual culture. Currently, we have a culture of anti-expertise. I think Michael Gove made that culture quite famous in the Brexit run-up with his, I think this country's had enough of experts. But the problem is, I think everyone's had enough of experts, and people are more willing now to. There's a narrative that I've noticed in a lot of the people in nutrition or health that position themselves as experts. They're often completely outside of the field. They're in one case of a guy in the States who wrote a book about nutrition and brain health. I think he went to film school, like as far away from nutrition as you could get. You get other people that are from medical backgrounds, and so there's this massive authority bias within the general public. Oh, they must know what they're talking about, even though they've never studied nutrition for more than 5 hours over 5 years. And then you get people coming from other disciplines that try and offer their kind of expertise. And what I've noticed is they tend to craft a narrative around their quote unquote expertise that relates to their previous discipline. And so, they'll say, well, the reason I have figured this out is because I'm an engineer. And so when I started reading nutrition science, it all clicked. Or the reason I figured this out is because I went to film school, and actually what figuring science out is about being creative. And it's like, no. And I think part of why I'm sensitive to that narrative is because I could easily concoct it for myself. I could sit here and tell you that my 9 years as a practicing barrister unlocked nutrition science for me, and it would be an absolute fucking lie. And so I'm wary, and I see through that narrative when I see other people advancing it. The bottom line is you can self-learn, but there's a limit to how much you can self-learn unless you formally train in a discipline. And science is absolutely one of those. In the same way that I could give you, the law of torts, and you could read it to your heart's content, but until you're practicing, you don't contextualize any of that information, right?
Yeah.
So it's the same in any discipline. And because nutrition is unique in the sense that everybody eats, there is this perception that we all have access to this knowledge just by virtue of needing nutrition on a daily basis as a species. Whereas you wouldn't make this analogy for law, for example. It would just be assumed you need a lawyer. That's expertise. You would never assume that a flight engineer knows how to fly the airplane, even though he probably knows where every little wire and what every little button does. So we make these assumptions about nutrition that we literally would never think of making with any other discipline. And the bottom line is reading research or becoming aware of methodology is a skill. Interpreting it is not just a matter of the skill of understanding where research fits and where its applicability starts and ends, and understanding principles of internal versus external validity and all this stuff. But it's also a matter of your wider knowledge in that discipline to understand how you can contextualize those results. Like, where does this fit in the big picture?
Yeah.
And all of that is absolutely nothing unique to nutrition and science. It is simply what we expect of any industry or any field or discipline that has a specific subject matter, and that specific subject matter requires some expertise. But with nutrition, we're willing to give a hall pass to anyone with abs on Instagram. We're willing to give a hall pass to anyone with a cool story about having some illness and they healed themselves with this kind of diet. We're willing to give a hall pass to literally anyone in a white coat. And people in the public are very easily misled by a lot of these narratives. But on the same kind of, I think, line of thinking, one thing that I also try and say is, people in the public also have to be a bit more vigilant about cultivating where they receive information from. Yeah. And I think that people often, they say, oh, well, I don't know, I'm so confused. And then you find out they're getting information from Netflix documentaries, they're getting it from idiot influencers. And like, well, of course you're confused. you're listening to people who you should just, with any applicable common sense, know that they're not credible. But again, going back to everything we were just saying, with nutrition, we give it a hall pass, Yeah. But with other disciplines, we don't. So I think that's what makes nutrition unique. But science is its own field. Interpreting research is a skill. Like any skill, it takes practice, it takes refinement, it takes a lot of hours. And you don't just lick it off the ground overnight. And you certainly don't have anything, that a previous life gives you towards those abilities. And I am acutely aware of that fact because I come from a different background.
Yeah. And I guess where it can be a little confusing for people is where it's the doctor who then moves into more of the nutrition model, because it feels like on the surface it's like, okay, they understand how to interpret medical research. Then it's the same thing, and so they'll just be able to pick that up pretty quickly.
Yes, exactly. And it won't. I mean, I gave a talk in a hospital the other day, and I always do this whenever I give talks to the medical profession, and I outline some of these differences. And people, because we don't often think about them, but it's very much kind of geeky methodology, but just, I guess, some kind of simple examples for listeners. And they're like, what is this difference? So one is, in the biomedical model, we have randomized controlled trials. Double-blind, placebo-controlled trials are considered the, quote, gold standard. So that means as a design, they are the strongest design that can show that the intervention that you do causes the outcome. And that design isn't kind of brought out of thin air. It's very specifically created out of preconditions that will allow us to show that the intervention caused the outcome. But those preconditions were based on the assumption that it will be applied to testing drugs. So a drug will be a very specific compound, and it will act on a very specific part of our physiology for a very specific outcome. So if we think about a statin, for example, which is a drug that lowers blood cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, we take a statin, the compound's designed with really specific qualities, and in testing it, we know exactly how much will be absorbed, where it will be distributed, where it will act, how long it will take to be excreted, and how it will be excreted, so via urine or via feces or whatever. We know that it will act by inhibiting a really specific enzyme known as the HMG-CoA reductase enzyme, and that in inhibiting that enzyme, the processes that allow new cholesterol to synthesize, to be created, will be inhibited downstream from that. And we have a reduction in blood cholesterol levels. So that's one specific compound designed to act on one specific enzyme for a very specific outcome. But if we take blueberries, for example, and we're looking at blueberries because we're interested in their role in brain health and memory, but we might be giving people a certain dose of blueberries every day for 12 weeks. But we can't say whether the outcome is because of the vitamin C content or whether it's because of the polyphenol content, which are these not nutritive, they're non-nutrients, but they have biological activity. And then within that polyphenol class, there are at least 7 different subcategories, and then within each subcategory of that there are subcategories again. So you can't have that conclusion that a specific isolated part of the food is responsible for the outcome. And the problem is, because of the biomedical model, rather than just be comfortable with the fact that the food is the exposure of interest, we've been obsessed with distilling down further to trying to find what specific compound in food is responsible for an outcome. But of course, that's largely irrelevant to people's eating habits, because you don't eat a polyphenol, you eat blueberries, you eat strawberries.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of these differences that mean that an example I use all the time just to illustrate this for readers or listeners is in observational research, which also gets a bad rep in nutrition, but is actually really important and more reliable than people give it credit for. There's been really strong associations in long-term studies between vitamin E intake and lower risk of cardiovascular and neurodegenerative disease, so Alzheimer's and dementia. And that lower risk was from dietary intake. So nuts, oily fish, avocados, green leafy vegetables, that kind of stuff. And it's really consistent. It's observed in different populations, in different countries, in different cohorts. And so in the biomedical model, when an observation is observed or they think something might be beneficial, they isolate it and then test it. So that's what happened with vitamin E. They took supplemental synthetic forms of vitamin E and ran loads of really large randomized control trials that cost potloads of millions, and all of them came back negative. And so the conclusion then is vitamin E does not reduce risk of heart disease. That's a completely incorrect conclusion, because vitamin E in diet is 8 different forms. There's 8 different forms of vitamin E that all come together and are consumed as the one compound. But we only know a lot about 1 out of those 8. So what they do in those supplement trials is they take the synthetic version of 1 of those 8 versions of the compound and give it. So the hypothesis was never that vitamin E reduces heart disease in a controlled trial. It should have been that a synthetic isolated version of one vitamin D or vitamin E compound lowers risk. Of course, they get to the end of the trial, they have no beneficial results, and they conclude that vitamin E doesn't reduce risk of heart disease. Again, that's wrong. It's the isolated supplemental version doesn't. But of course, they did not test the effects of consuming vitamin E through diet. So sometimes what we call reductionism, which is where we want to get to this exact tiny, minute little causative agent in a diet or in a food, is actually not serving investigating nutrition and health outcomes very well.
Yeah. And I think that's the case with a lot of the testing of so-called antioxidants. When you reduce them to just the one at a time, it doesn't bode particularly well. But when you have them in food sources, it does work very well. And I think some of that is also because what is credited to being the antioxidants is actually more to do with polyphenols or hormesis or something else.
Exactly. And it's, interesting that most of the antioxidant trials, if not all, have largely failed. And absolutely hormesis you mentioned. So this idea that, nutrients and biologically active constituents of food, they generally act at low doses. We don't need them in huge doses. And so at low doses, they have biological activity. But if you take them in very high doses, they have the opposite effect. And that principle might be really important for why they have biological activity in food, but not when we isolate them and double the concentration of them as a supplement. It may be one reason why supplementing with vitamin A was actually observed to be associated with cancer. Now, the problem, it was lung cancer specifically, the problem was that it was in a cohort of smokers. So it's very difficult not to just look at the obvious one there and be like, well, let's maybe not blame but it was the people taking vitamin A supplements had higher incidence than even smokers. So it was the idea that there was an aggravating effect. And yeah, for all these reasons, we're very much, and I think the field of nutrition has been live to this for certainly the last 5, 7, maybe 10 years, and is very much looking to do food-based interventions. So you have the famous Predimed trial in Spain, where they didn't give people supplemental vitamin E and oleic acid or polyphenols. The intervention was specifically to consume 4 tablespoons of olive oil a day in one group, and the other group ate an ounce of nuts every day. So food-based interventions are I think, the future, but we are still very much stuck in a bit of a nutrient-focused paradigm sometimes with research and when we ask questions about diet and health relationships.
And you talked before or mentioned before about like observational studies often being talked down about, and so like where do you think that they're good, or why do you think people are misunderstanding how helpful they can actually be?
Why? I think there's three types of people who dismiss nutritional epidemiology, which is observational research. And the first two are people who don't understand nutritional epidemiology. And the third are people for whom the findings don't agree with their particular worldview. I think epidemiology is dismissed because in the biomedical model, there were a few scares on the disconnect between some results in population research and some results when they looked at it in RCTs. And the most famous example of that is related to, in the late 80s and early 90s, hormone replacement therapy and cardiovascular disease risk. And this is just hammered into med students now in particular. But what in effect occurred was in observational research, there was a suggestion that hormone replacement therapy lowered risk of cardiovascular disease. So then they ran a large randomized controlled trial, and that found the exact opposite, that there was actually an increased risk of cardiovascular disease in the group taking HRT, and the trial was discontinued. And it's used as an example of, you see, we can't trust the observation. But actually, when you scrutinize both those studies in more detail, what you realize is that the difference in the findings related to the timing of initiating hormone replacement therapy relative to the timing of the onset of menopause. When you factored in those two timing elements, the results actually were largely in accordance with each other. And the message for me here is never that we dismiss epidemiology. It's that our duty as scientists is to reconcile discordant results by scrutinizing the literature in a bit more detail and doing our due diligence to make sure that we come up with the right answer as to why there was or was not a difference. And I think that part of the wider problem why that doesn't happen a lot is because although we're training people to be healthcare professionals, you go to med school, you're quote unquote learning science, but you're not really, you're just learning information. You know, you go to study dietetics or nutrition, it's the same. You're given research papers, but really you're approaching it the way you'd approach your A levels. You know, it's just like learn the information, get through. Yeah. And so a massive problem that we have now in healthcare is critical illiteracy. And people assume that their degree correlates to the ability to critically appraise scientific research. And unfortunately, it absolutely doesn't. And I think we need to be a bit live to that. But that's kind of almost a separate rabbit hole. Coming back to observational research, with nutrition, because most of the diseases that face us in society now, like cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes and dementia and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, these kind of cardiometabolic and neurological conditions, they don't develop early. They have what are known as long latency periods. So you may get heart disease at 55, but you're influencing getting that disease at 30, at 25, at 20 with nutritional practices or other lifestyle variables. I don't want to put everything on nutrition earlier in life. Point being that we can't do an RCT randomizing people to a heart healthy diet at the age of 20 and expect them to stay in an RCT for 50 years. So it's just never going to happen. So because we can't do that, we use what are known as prospective cohort studies. And they're prospective because we take people at a stage in their life before they have any disease. So they might be 30 or 35 or 40 when they're recruited. They don't have heart disease. And we're going to look at what happens over 20 years and who gets heart disease. And we're going to use different collection methods to assess their diet over time. And that is the only way we can investigate long-term diet-disease relationships in nutrition, because we can't lock people in a room for 50 years and investigate these things. And people assume that it's entirely unreliable because there's a margin of error in the questionnaire methods that are used to assess people's diets. And food frequency questionnaires are often used. But people dismiss the food frequency questionnaire accuracy with rather I find an ignorance of understanding what they're used for and what their purpose is. So the first thing to understand is that any food frequency questionnaire to be used in a population will be specific to the population. So if we're going to investigate the UK population, we're going to develop a food frequency questionnaire. And at the start, what we'll do is we'll validate it by getting a subgroup of people. So let's say we have a big study, we have 40,000 people. We'll take a group of maybe 4,000 out of that are representative of the whole sample.
Yeah.
And what we'll do is we'll get them to weigh food, all their food, and measure their beverage intake for a week. So that's as accurate a way you can get of assessing someone's diet. And then what will happen is they'll test the food frequency questionnaire in another small group of, say, 4,000. And then what they'll do is they'll compare the results of the food frequency questionnaire to the weighted food diary and see how well they correlate. So if we're looking to look at saturated fat, for example, we'll see how well using the food frequency questionnaires to distill down how much saturated fat was in the diet correlates with the weighted food diary. And the coefficient, the actual relationship between them is dependent on the nutrient, but is often higher than people think. So for saturated fat, for example, we know that from validating food frequency questionnaires that the correlation coefficient is about 0.6 to 0.7, sometimes as high as. So that basically means like 70% correlation, right? Now, the thing we have to then understand is that we're not looking to examine with 100% accuracy someone's diet.
Yeah.
So if you think about this, every day people do not get up and weigh and measure every morsel of food. Well, not like maybe 0.5% of the bro population, but like normal people don't do that for the most part. But they might eat fairly similar foods. Someone might have porridge every day for breakfast, and they might free pour it, or they might get a measuring cup out and kind of pour it in. And maybe, let's say they have 80 grams one day because they free poured it in, and the other day they're kind of particularly hungry. They get out the measuring cup and they fill a good heaped cup and they dump that in, and that's about 120 grams. And so on and so forth. And maybe it averages out over the lifetime as, say, 90 grams a day. Because of those fluctuations, we'll never, in free living normal populations that are going about their daily lives, you never eat 100% of the same thing every day.
Yeah.
So what food frequency questionnaires are designed to capture is your average intake over time. So they're not supposed to be, nor could they ever be 100% accurate. But actually, that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in the average intake over time. And the important thing to remember then is when we get to these conclusions at the end of this study and we say a high saturated fat intake was associated with heart disease, or a high polyunsaturated fat intake was associated with lower risk, because we're looking at average intake, and because the correlation is generally lower than the weighted diary, the effect of this is that the estimates are underestimated. And I think that that's a really important point to make for people. So when we have these associations, they're often underestimated. So maybe the protective effect of a compound is more, but maybe the negative effect of another compound is more as well.
Yeah.
And so when we look at the track record of observational research in nutrition, it started in the 1920s when the major public health issues were not the conditions we have today, but they were actually deficiencies. So beriberi, vitamin B1 deficiency, or iodine deficiency and goiter, or vitamin D deficiency and rickets or osteomalacia, or a condition known as pellagra, which is a vitamin B3 deficiency. All of those relationships were identified through observational research, and all of those relationships were eradicated from the population by using interventions, so fortifying salt with iodine, fortifying milk with vitamin D, fortifying wheat and breads and cereals with B vitamins. So all of these conditions were eradicated successfully by implementing the results of observational research. We fast forward to now, we have eradicated trans fats from the food supply, largely because of observational research. We have observational research that continues to show the same thing over and over again with regard to heart disease, which is that low intake of unsaturated fats and high intake of saturated fats puts people at risk for cardiovascular and heart disease. And that's supported by controlled studies, then looking at the changes that happen in, say, cholesterol and stuff like that. We have really strong observations of the protective effect of a high dietary fiber intake from observations, and we have controlled trials that support that. So I think that people are too quick to dismiss nutritional epidemiology when the track record so far warrants more confidence in the conclusions that it's given us. And generally the dismissal comes out of a place of ignorance in my experience, and people simply don't understand the methodology used, and they simply don't understand that particular discipline of scientific research.
And I know, like, there's a lot of talk about, like, the hierarchy of scientific evidence. So, like, systematic reviews being at the top, and then randomized controlled studies. Like, do you think that actually holds true for nutrition science, or there should be basically a separate hierarchy of scientific evidence for nutrition?
I definitely think there should. Yeah. I think I have so many problems with you've just opened a can of worms.
Okay.
I have a big problem with the hierarchy of evidence for two or maybe three reasons. The first is going back to that thing I said about, healthcare professionals, not in all disciplines, like it's nutrition and dietetics, it's medicine, but we have this real kind of widespread critical illiteracy. I mean, people are not good at critically appraising scientific research. And often they don't have to be to do their job well. It's not a criticism. It's just when people weigh in using the fact that, hey, I'm a doctor, or hey, I'm a dietitian, as the basis for listen to what I'm saying about this study, when what they say clearly shows they don't understand what the study did or showed, then that's a problem. But the hierarchy of evidence is used as a crutch in many respects. And so people assume that if they're reading a study and it was a systematic review, or in particular, if it was a meta-analysis, or if it was an RCT, then its results are automatically correct because of what the study was in terms of its design, nominally. That's an entirely false premise. And I see it happening all the time in these conversations that are, quote, evidence-based. And people say, well, this was an RCT. And it's generally the same people who dismiss observational research without understanding it. And they'll say, well, association isn't causation. Well, no, association is association. And when the association is consistent and is shown in different populations and keeps coming up again and again, then we use our brains and we infer causation using what's known as the Bradford-Hill criteria. But the hierarchy of evidence becomes a problem for the conversations about the evidence base, because people assume that the hierarchy of evidence is a standard of proof. Well, if this is on top of the pyramid, it's correct because it's on top of the pyramid. And it leads to incorrect conclusions about the nature of causation when we're talking about different issues. For nutrition science, it's particularly problematic because prospective cohort studies are third on the pyramid, and they're behind randomized controlled trials, and they're behind systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And they're way behind in terms of the weight that people give to them. And there are different systems people use in research to grade evidence, and one is actually known as the grading system. But the grading system basically says if a study is observational, it's not worth the paper it's written on. So you get these conclusions. And an example is the recent, keep eating as much meat as you want conclusion from that Annals of Internal Medicine study. But most of the research we have supporting the recommendations we have to lower red and particularly processed meat consumption come from a combination of observational research and then mechanistic studies. So studies either very short term in humans or in animal models, looking at why there could be a cause and effect relationship. So immediately, the whole real weight of the evidence supporting that was written out of consideration because it was observational, allowing them to come to the conclusions they did. In nutrition, we will always have more prospective cohort studies giving us information on a particular issue than we will randomized controlled trials. And for me, the hierarchy of evidence merely indicates increasing potential confidence that a study, if it was done well, indicates a cause-effect, direct cause-effect relationship. That is all the hierarchy of evidence is. And when we go beyond that and assume that the hierarchy means something beyond that, we're in trouble. True scientific thinking and true scientific inquiry and conclusions wouldn't view the hierarchy at all. It would simply say, we have a total body of evidence. How do we assess it all? And how do we use our critical thinking and our scientific thinking to arrive at conclusions that probably, or in a probabilistic sense, because that's all science gives us, is closer to an approximate truth than the other alternatives that could be presented from that same available body of information. And so it's a collective process of evaluation and of reconciling different forms of evidence with each other and not being methodologically prejudiced against a source of fact or of evidence simply because it was a certain trial design or a certain study type. And in nutrition, this is really problematic because particularly meta-analyses in the biomedical model where they come from, they're designed to give really confident conclusion on the question being asked. And so if we're going back to our statin example, if we do a meta-analysis of statin trials, well, we know that they've all been really tightly controlled. They've been controlled with a placebo. They might have been for similar durations. They're all in the same population because they're people with high cholesterol and heart disease. And they're all using similar drugs or similar doses. And if not, it's so easy to stratify people based on the dose and the drug. And so meta-analysis in that context gives you really confident conclusions on the efficacy of that intervention. Whereas in nutrition, particularly if prospective cohort studies are included, they might have been done in different populations. They have different high or low levels of any given nutrient. They were studied over a different time period. Their baseline characteristics were different. So one cohort started at 30, the other at 45. They have different stages of the disease advancing at that point. Even if they don't have a diagnosis, the underlying processes are at play. You just get this completely fudged middle ground, muddy water conclusion. And then people go, we can't trust nutrition science. And it's like, well, no, we just can't trust you and your methodology.
Yeah, you're not comparing apples with apples. You
are not. You are comparing apples and pigs. And they couldn't be any different. So, in meta-analyses, you're supposed to compare apples with apples, and that just doesn't happen. So the hierarchy of evidence is more trouble than it's worth. And I think we could really do with just re-emphasizing what its actual purpose is. And all it is potentially increasing confidence. And I use the word potential very deliberately, because whether that potential is realized or not depends on the methodology used, the rigorousness of the study, and all of that. And in many respects, and people forget this all the time, a really well-conducted prospective cohort study that is observational has more power to infer causation than a badly controlled and executed randomized controlled trial.
Yeah. And one of the things about this is then like taking that evidence and then how do you use that in a sort of evidence-based practice. And I was reading an article, I think you linked to it recently on your Instagram from Signa Nutrition, where they talked about like the three components of an evidence-based practice being best current evidence, then the individual's needs, ability, and personal experience, and how like those three things need to come together. So do you want to speak a little bit about that?
I think we forget that, evidence-based practice is a Venn diagram. And one rung of that then is the evidence. What research is there? What is it telling us? Another is the clinical experience of the practitioner. And the third is the patient preference. And we're being, I think, at this moment, a bit too didactic with science, and there's a lot of weaponizing of science. And what I mean by that is, using science just to further an agenda, or assuming that if their science says X, then X holds in all circumstances. And that's absolutely not true. And it never has been. And I think part of the problem with this, certainly in medicine, there's a really good critique by a very good proponent of, but also critic of, evidence-based medicine, Trish Greenhalgh. And she basically, her commentary was published, about 10 years ago at this point, in the BMJ, but she spoke about how the problem with evidence-based medicine as a model was that it was only using the evidence to codify if A happens, then B, if B happens, then C, basically, and removing clinical experience and the input of the practitioner from the scenario. And that's what's come to pass. So there's no real scope for people in medicine to do anything other than the chart is telling them to do. Yeah. Is that really practicing healthcare? I would argue not. And we are at a similar point in many respects with nutrition, particularly within dietetics, which is very kind of resistant to change because of the fact that dietetics has been the only regulated and recognized nutrition title. There's a lot of baggage, shall we say, that comes along with that, hashtag trusted dietitian, which is just such a toxic campaign, because why would I trust someone if the advice I'm getting is bad, right? Yeah. So it's appeal to authority bias and nothing else. And we see it in other healthcare disciplines as well. And so I think we are forgetting that clinical experience really does count for people that are clinicians. And in experience and in gathering it, it's where people are able to contextualize this body of evidence that they're supposed to be applying. And by contextualize it, they're able to see where the strengths and limitations of the applicability lie. And they're able to have a consideration for, okay, this is what this body of evidence is telling me, but is it all useful? Who is it true for? Is it true for all people in all circumstances? If this trial found that intervention A was good for outcome B, who is that trial in? Who is that study in? And is this necessarily going to hold true in the case of the person sitting in front of me? Yeah. And we've become more obsessed with this trial found A caused B, so that's what evidence-based practice is. You sit and you shove A equals B down their throat. And it's your job as a practitioner to get them to do intervention A because it caused outcome B. And you see that particularly in the kind of health and fitness space, which is an area that I think is generally really problematic for a lot of the conversations around nutrition. But it's this assumption, one, the RCT is God. Two, if an intervention found, high protein intake equals, more fat mass reduction over 12 weeks, I will make sure that every one of my clients eats a high protein diet. It's completely forgetting that clinical experience is the experience of how you put this into practice, not just I take what's there and I force it on everyone because that's the evidence, quote unquote. Yeah. And again, in this conversation, coming to the last but almost the most important point is the patient preference. What if they don't want to shovel Greek yogurt down their throat 4 times a day and eat every 3 hours and have X amount of and this very kind of just broadly assumed compliance approach. And I think one thing we're lacking, particularly in nutrition, is we just don't really have the human voice present in science. Yeah. We don't really do a lot of qualitative research, which I think is an enormous limitation of nutrition science. We've ran trial after trial after trial for 30 years looking at diet A versus diet B and diet C versus diet D, weight loss as an outcome, has been the primary concern of the field, and never once really has there been a broad influx of qualitative research to get the human voice in that. And you read trial after trial where the attrition rate was 50%, 40%, 35%, people dropping out. And all it is one sentence in a very vapid paper, and that it's framed as a percentage. And you're like, okay, well, why did they drop out? Where is the qualitative element that investigated why did they struggle with this? Was the intervention shit? Were they starving? You know, all this kind of stuff. And we have missed a huge trick over the last 30 years by not incorporating the human voice into nutrition research. I think we would have a much more actionable evidence base right now if we had done so. But we've been so obsessed with the p-value, and that's science generally, to be perfectly honest, over the last 50 years.
Yeah.
We're more obsessed with the p-value than we are with the kind of biological relevance and real-world applicability of the results. And we certainly have done intervention after intervention in nutrition without actually trying to see what the barriers are, what was good, what was bad, why could people do it, why could people not? You know, why did 50% of the trial drop out after 6 weeks? And we don't have that data because we've never asked the question.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, look, for me, because I do so much one-on-one work now, so much of what I read and focus on is like, how can I be better as a practitioner? Right. And not necessarily like, how do I know more about nutrition, but like, how do I communicate better? How do I do behavior change? Like, that's where the focus is.
100%.
And I also think just the other thing with this evidence-based practice is, for this to really work, there needs to be an open-mindedness. And there's an open-mindedness in terms of, okay, realizing that evidence will change and I have to change my views on it, but also that sometimes personal experience is wrong. Like I read The Undoing Project, which is about like Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman, looking at how often our intuitions are wrong.
Right.
And so I'm constantly like just re-asking myself, like, okay, why do I know this? Why do I think this? What would happen if I did something different here? Not just like, oh, I've seen this work so many times with other people, so it must be right. But thinking, okay, could there be a different way that's actually better than this? Or could there be some harms that are coming to this that I'm just not noticing because there's some blind spot or whatever? So I think for evidence-based practice to genuinely work, they're really like, people have to take the ego out of it and be just open to, I could be wrong, the evidence could be wrong, and how can I better serve the person who's in front of me?
Right. And I think that's incredibly prescient right now, because I think when we were talking about experience there, you know, the clinical experience is the experience of applying an evidence base. It's not, oh, I went with this because my gut feeling says so.
Yeah.
And I think that part of the problem with that is, yes, you're right. Research is always subject to change. And we're, at the end of the day, you know, as much as we love to think we're rational creatures that make decisions based on, you know, sound, you know, evidence and principles, the bottom line is we are fallible, irrational, emotional chimpanzees. And the more that we can remind ourselves of that, I always refer to like people on Instagram and social media as sapiens. And people ask me, why do you call everyone sapiens? And I'm like, because I want a daily reminder nearly that we are just chimps, basically, and that the more we can, and people, it's not a negative, it's just a polite reminder to, like you said, how do I know what I know? Could what I know be wrong? Has what I know changed? And how do I keep asking questions of myself and my practice so that I'm constantly checking my innate default human capacity to fuck up,
to all the biases and all the heuristics that we have,
because thinking and Daniel Kahneman, thinking fast and slow, but you know, thinking is a resource consuming activity for human beings. We're a default lazy species that will operate in default mode in terms of our cognitive capacities, unless we have to force ourselves into a mode where we are thinking logically and trying to crunch on a problem or what that is. And so our brain likes to default to heuristics. It likes to default to the gut feeling. It likes to default to things we think we know, or that we've convinced ourselves we do know and that are, quote, true. And if we can acknowledge that this is just an innate part of being a fallible, emotional, irrational ape, then we're better thinkers, because then we're able to not fall into the hubris of the prefrontal cortex and assume that we're, great because we have the capacity to think. And so it's generally, I find that the danger is when people are not aware of these factors, or where they're insistent that, I'm aware of my biases, but then they just continue wearing them on their sleeve. And I was in an interesting back and forth recently, earlier in the week, with one of the doctors that appeared on the Game Changers documentary. And it was just so insightful to me to see how this individual portrayed the documentary and how they saw it as this really benevolent, an altruistic act of, balancing, well, there are all these awful myths about vegan diets and performance. And so all we were doing was setting out that you can really have high level performance on a vegan diet. And that's all it was saying. And it's like, well, if you think that that's all that it was saying, then you are so blind to what actually has become the product. And the way that they continue to frame the information that was in it and what it actually meant for the wider public was just such this level of blinkers on, of cognitive dissonance, that I was so entertained by it. Because on my suggestion that they were blind to all of these, the way it's being received, the way it's being talked about and everything like that, I got this kind of soliloquy about how, they're a medical doctor and they used to think this, but now they've changed their mind and they're, rational and objective and unbiased. And I was just like, wow, all I could picture was a chimpanzee basically gooing and guying at me, because I was like, there's the fallible human ape telling me how objective and unbiased they are while they appear on a documentary telling you you'll get better boners from black bean burritos. So yeah, interesting dialogue. But I think it comes back to, like what you're saying, the fallibility of being human. And it's not I think people are resistant to it because they see it as a negative, and it's like, it's not a negative. It's simply the human condition. And if we ask questions of ourselves, we can be better practitioners because we constantly question what we know and how we're applying what we know. And we're constantly able to update what we know and even improve on how we're applying it, because we've constantly questioned our practice and what we're doing.
Yeah. And I think it's also because, and this is happening more and more, people's beliefs in, or just, I don't even know how you characterize things that people think of are facts, become part of their identity, as opposed to these are just facts that I know about a particular topic. Right. So it's not like, I just need to change these ideas. It's like, but I was the paleo guy and I now have to tell everyone that I'm no longer the paleo guy. And that's a much bigger hurdle to get over than just, when I wrote that one article about that one thing, I've now reviewed the evidence that's just come out and I was wrong.
Yes, absolutely. And Kieran O'Regan, who is one of the Sigma nutrition coaches and is writing this amazing series on, are you really science-based? And it's really epistemological and an excellent kind of critique of what scientific thinking means and how we apply this all. And he makes a point in one of the Sigma articles that it's the difference between, you having an opinion or an idea about something and you being that opinion, an idea. And if you have an opinion at one given time, you can change it. But if you are the opinion, then all of your human instincts about your identity and your self-construct and all of this are now tied up in that belief.
Yeah.
And you're not changing your opinion, you're changing you. And no human is going to do that unless something really, really bad happens. And that's where we get into so much of the problem with the discourse in nutrition now, because to me, I think it's the only health science that I can think of that simultaneously doubles up as a belief system. Yeah. And people don't say, I follow a vegan lifestyle. They say, I am vegan. They don't say, I follow a low-carb diet. They say, I am low-carb. And they are the belief, they are the diet. And so, you know, all of the baggage that comes wrapped up in that makes for a really fractious discourse that we have going on right now. And it's really, really frustrating.
Yeah, definitely. Because you then look at, they're like, oh, I'm paleo. But when I looked at this research, I was really unbiased. And you're like, right. How do you hold those two things right at the same time?
Right, exactly. You know, and it's like, you can't. Interestingly, that's exactly part of the dialogue that I had with this person that was on the Game Changers documentary as one of the authorities, and he was just like, you know, well, it's because I've looked at the science that I've now formed these views. And I'm like, so you're saying you use the science to form a bias as opposed to just to inform a position? You know, and I found it a funny kind of self-contradiction in the point that the person was trying to make. And so there is a big difference, and it's looking at research or looking at evidence to come to a conclusion, knowing that that conclusion is subject to change.
Yeah.
And that's the nature of science, and that's what separates scientific thinking. Whereas in the example I'm referring to, what was clearly at play was using science to come to a finite conclusion that this is the best approach.
Yeah. And
that's the difference. And it's subtle, but it's very important in distinguishing when someone's saying, well, I've arrived at this conclusion and it's the best based on, and it's like, well, if you're arriving at that conclusion in a finite sense, then you're not understanding what scientific thinking is.
Yeah, I think the classic example was when someone asked Gary Taubes if all the evidence came back to proving that low carb was wrong, would he accept it? And he said no. No,
because we know we're right. And it was like, I hate you so much. Everything about your being.
Let's just shift directions a little bit and talk about like public health nutrition. Yeah. And I know like this is an area that often gets a lot of bad rap. So yeah, why don't you talk a little about public health nutrition and maybe some of the difficulties that it has as making recommendations at a population level.
Yeah, and this was something, you know, kind of myself and Josh tried to talk about a little bit, was, you know, how it is that we come to conclusions with nutrition, and we know a bit more than people give us credit for, and how do you communicate that? And, you know, if you think about the evolution of public health nutrition, you know, through the 20s and 30s, it was a much simpler process because the conditions that public health nutrition needed to address were conditions defined by isolated single nutrient deficiencies. And so by identifying that deficiency and the prevalence of it in the population, you were able to come up with simple interventions that eradicated that condition. I think we talked about this a bit earlier, but the key distinction there is having that benefit and having that effect in the population didn't require necessarily big education campaigns or big, you know, lobbying or anything like that. It simply required fortifying milk with vitamin D or adding B vitamins to flour, and the whole population consumes bread. So this is going to be a really effective vehicle to address this very specific issue and bolster nutrition status in the population.
Yeah, so individuals didn't have to make a choice.
Individuals didn't have to make a choice, exactly. And it didn't require any sort of like policy level change or interventions upstream other than deciding we need to do this, and then it was done. And, you know, we've had this seismic shift in the dynamics of our relationship between industry and the food environment. And that shift while we're all very keen to look at nutritional determinants of that, did we start eating more sugar in the 1970s? Or did we start eating more fat, or did we start eating less of something? And while there are certain patterns there that we can say, the shift, the reason why it's a pattern shift and not an isolated nutrient shift as it was in the 20s or 30s is because it's been an economic shift. The shift has reflected a kind of second industrial revolution where the industrialization is not machinery, but the industrialization of the food supply. And that has created a very unique dynamic that I think we're only coming to have a body of evidence to understand now. But the problem is, now is when we also have these, enormous rates of type 2 diabetes, even though cardiovascular disease has been cut in half in terms of mortality rates since the 60s. It's still the leading cause of mortality in Western industrialized countries. So we still have we've had these emergence and this trajectory upwards in these, what we'll call chronic lifestyle diseases, that is at proportions that certainly Western industrialized societies are feeling the brunt of. But the problem is, when you step back and you try and look a little bit deeper at cause here, it becomes nothing to do with nutrition.
Yeah.
And really what defines it in particular is the neoliberal economic model: deregulation, no cap or barriers to industry, to market forces at play. The free market will decide. The problem with that mantra is the way the free market has decided, and I say decided in a pejorative sense because most people in the free market have not had the freedom to make these decisions, is, for example, in the UK, there was a paper published 2 years ago that Public Health England even put a map on their website about, was the density of fast food outlets relative to quintiles of social deprivation. So across the UK, you have the greatest density of, say, McDonald's, KFC. There was 4 they modeled in the study: McDonald's, KFC, Burger King, and one of those like chicken shacks. The greatest density of all 4 establishments is in the areas of the lowest socioeconomic status across the UK.
Was this study done where they did it over like every time the census was taken? Because there was one that I was looking at where every time the census was taken and then particular areas went up to be sort of higher socioeconomics or came down, that actually those restaurants and stuff then shifted as well.
No, this was just looking at current levels, okay. But that is really, really interesting. And the shift, yeah. So yeah, one area gets a Waitrose as it goes up, and then the others get McDonald's Correct. And KFC. Yeah, and these are market forces at play, and so in order to address that, you have to really start to target industry, and you have to start to target having regulation and legislation and interventions that are what they call upstream. So they're not looking at the individual level. They're not looking at behavior change at the individual level. They're looking at modifying the environment to help individuals who are not in a position to change the environment for themselves. The problem is neoliberalism dictates you don't mess with anything. You just deregulate every single element of society, and you throw the pitchforks out there and let the place decay. And that political and economic ideology is the biggest barrier to affecting change. So what happens in public health nutrition is they'll use a vehicle like sugar. So even though sugar is not the cause of type 2 diabetes, for example, even though sugar is not the cause of cardiovascular disease, and even though there are a whole diet pattern at play here and not simply one nutrient, sugar becomes a vehicle to get other issues on the table. And so that becomes the focus of trying to get some policy. It becomes the focus to try and get an initial tax. It becomes the focus to try and get people comfortable with mandatory regulation, which a tax obviously is. It's not a voluntary tax, it's mandatory. And it's essentially a policy vehicle to get these other elements on the table. The problem then is people outside of public health nutrition look at that, particularly in the current environment we have, where there's very much a pushback against kind of diets. There's a very big acceptance now of the effects of stigma. There's a very big kind of non-diet movement. And everyone from kind of that paradigm then looks at this and goes, oh, you're demonizing sugar. And so there's this total disconnect between the reason why sugar is being used and the way it's being perceived by other paradigms within nutrition. And then, for example, you get kind of beyond that and you get into even getting policy on the table in the first place. And the rhetoric of that is still very much tied up in words like obesity and other kind of terminology, weight-related terminology. And again, there will be people from outside of public health nutrition will look at that and be like, this is stigmatizing, this is a problem, you know, you're not paying attention to X, Y, and Z factors. But the reality is you're going to bat against people who have absolutely no idea about stigma. They've no idea about the health issues facing the population. They're mostly Oxbridge-type wealthy politicians. So unfortunately, the language that has to be used right now, it can obviously change, but the language that has to be used to even get the attention of people that you want to affect change is still tied up in that rhetoric. And of course, that's going to be a slow process to change, but it doesn't mean that people in the public health space are ignorant of these issues. It just means, unfortunately, they're in this really difficult place where they have to balance knowing that, for example, the evidence for stigma exists versus the pragmatism of how much they can take that into the discussions they have for an upcoming campaign, for example. Knowing also, and I think this is really important, that industry are at the table every step of the way. So the big barrier right now, one of the biggest barriers, is that usually what you should do is you should form a policy and then you bring industry in and you say, well, this is the policy we've decided on based on the evidence, which you're industry, so you're not in a position to assess or appraise. So now we're talking with you about how we're going to implement this policy and how you're going to help us implement it. What happens is the policy is shaped by industry from the get-go. So if you have the Cancer Research UK example, which was so appalling, but they were getting input from professionals, psychologists, public health nutritionists, basically saying don't do this again because they did it last year. Using the evidence in favor of weight stigma, but and all of these other variables, and also more importantly, the evidence that
socioeconomics,
right? Yeah,
more than
socioeconomics, and the fact that we know from smoking and other behavioral correlates of determinants of health that negatively phrasing things does not affect behavior change. But this information was going to people who are not psychologists and are not public health nutritionists and are not any sort of other healthcare professional. They're, marketing and PR people within a charity who are going, well, we think this will have high impact, right? So then the campaign comes out, and then anyone that's been working in the proximity of it gets slammed. And I think a big part of the problem now is, it's really, really difficult at the public health level to get anything that will be effective brought in, because everything that will be effective is mandatory, essentially, in its regulation. We have enough evidence for action. There is no action being taken by government or industry because government don't want to take action and industry are happy for the status quo to continue. And so, and then on the sidelines watching all of this, you have paradigms that are shouting at everything that's going on for not considering X, not considering Y, being stigmatizing, demonizing food, and all of this stuff. And so it's a bit of a difficult conversation. I don't think either side are doing particularly well at communicating with each other to understand their respective nuances. It's impossible to communicate nuance to a whole population. And I think that really the big missing link here is both sides assume it's what I notice in talking to people on both sides of, I guess, the divide is both sides make a lot of assumptions that neither of them have biases against the other. both sides make assumptions that they know entirely what the other side are talking about, and that they've listened in a reasoned and open-minded way to all of their concerns and have ironically just decided they're all bullshit. So, which if anything speaks of listening to something with your mind made up already and your biases on your sleeve, it's that conclusion, right? So both sides act like they've given all the time in the world to the other to figure it all out and to listen to it, when neither of them obviously have. And it's a real error in communication. And I have empathy for both. I think at the end of the day, it's very, very difficult to the stigma, element of the conversation, which is only one part of it, obviously. There is a broader acceptance for that, I think, in the last year to 18 months, with the WHO report in particular really adding to the weight of, hey, this is a legitimate thing. We have a really accumulated body of evidence supporting it. But some of the other stuff is a bit more difficult. For example, campaigns where they'll remove, junk food advertising on the tube, just as an example, and a big criticism that you're demonizing foods and this is going to lead to negative. No, I mean, show me evidence that relates simply taking down the burger ad to someone then going and seeking out the burger because they noticed it wasn't there. Like the really, really, really tenuous allegations of how this campaign or similar campaigns will play out at the population level. I think that the demonizing food card personally is way overplayed. I think the stigma card is then downplayed to a degree on the other side of the house. So it's a very difficult conversation landscape right now. I think the biggest problem is neither side are truly listening to what the others are saying. And I think if there was more appreciation of how difficult it is to get anything done at the public health level, there'd be less criticism of one side. And I think if there was more appreciation for how a lot of our approaches currently do have an impact in the population, there would be more appreciation on the other side. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see where that one goes.
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a difficult thing to make a change at a population level. I think the things that I would say that look better are, and I don't know if this is across the board, but there seems to be more of a shift away from just simply we need to educate people more and people need to make better choices and that this is an individual thing to okay, how do we change the environment so that the right choice is the easy choice, so people don't even need to have to make that choice because this thing's just been removed from the situation, or this thing's just been plugged in front of them, so that it just naturally happens. Because we were talking before we record, just like the problem with cognitive dietary restraint, and that when someone has to feel like they're actively restricting, that there's a real problem with that. But if that choice just isn't there to begin with, like people ate differently in the 1920s, not because we had the exact same food environment and people were just like different in their thinking then. It was because there was a different food environment in front of them. Right,
exactly. And I think the one thing that, yes, absolutely, I think you're right. There is a massively broad acceptance now that the narratives about personal responsibility are nonsense and they're unsupported by evidence entirely. The narratives about education are also nonsense for the most part.
The people where education works for is when you have influence and when you have money and when you have time and all of that.
Right, so exactly. So it comes back to the socioeconomic determinants. Yeah. But, if you line 10 people up against a wall, even from the most socially deprived background, and ask them if eating vegetables and fruit is good for them, I mean, 8 will say yes. So maybe education serves, and just broadly speaking, education is not the barrier. And again, we had, this isn't an opinion, this is supported by research we have looking at these questions. There was a really nice qualitative paper published last year, which looked at these issues and the food environment. And it was just, again, the human voice. It was so, because they published quotes, obviously, in the paper. And some of it was really insightful, and I'm paraphrasing them, but, people saying, I know eating fruits and vegetables is good for me. I just don't have them. They're literally not available in my locality. Or it would be great to go to a supermarket, but there literally is not one in a surrounding, three postcode area, and this kind of thing. And so we're very much coming back to socioeconomic barriers, time, single parent working households, multiple jobs, low wages, all of these issues. And those are political conversations. And part of the problem now is we politicize facts. And the more that we can just get a broad acceptance that they are the facts, the more then we can progress to the political conversations about what to do about those facts. But right now we're still all arguing over the facts because it suits the current political and economic ideology to keep everyone arguing over the facts as if there's some sort of debate. But I think the move away from that individual narrative, the move to accept this is an environmental issue, I think the Foresight Group were really important in helping that. And was it the
Foresight, the group that did the Marmot report, or was that someone separate?
No, the Marmot report was Sir Michael Marmot. That was separate. That's excellent. The Foresight Group is a separate group, but a similar report, very much coming to similar conclusions.
Was that where they identified like 100 or 120 different factors that lead to higher weight?
At least. So they have this map, and if listeners just Google Foresight Group map, they will get presented with, there was 7 different domains: psychological, biological, environmental, and all these other, I can't remember the full 7, but within each one of them was a specific element or aspect or factor. And then they linked all of those factors to each other. And it just looks like this giant, elaborate spider's web.
Yeah.
And for me, it's the best visual representation for the complexity of the situation that we're in with regard to public health.
Yeah.
And how complex it will be to disentangle it. But it very much then makes you realize that the individual is tied up in that spider's web. And yes, human nature and behavior being what it is, some people will navigate that better than others. Not everyone born into socially disadvantaged circumstances is going to end up type 2 diabetic or suffer coronary heart disease at 50. Not everyone born in with a silver spoon is going to be free of those conditions, right? So it's not that it's completely boiled down to those variables, like your birthright, essentially. Yeah. What it's about is simply that the risk in that given individual is so much stacked higher because of the social and economic circumstances that they're born into. So it's about risk. It's not that everyone will necessarily succumb to that risk. But this focus now on the big picture stuff, on regulation, on tax, the focus on industry, there's a big push in public health nutrition now happening. There was a committee the other day convened where multiple experts were basically berating the government by basically, and again, paraphrasing the briefs of evidence given, but basically saying, this isn't about evidence. We have all the information we need. You're simply not acting. And the harsh reality is that there won't be action until we make this a political issue and we put, a party, whoever they are, in power that are happy to not just be complete slaves to neoliberal ideology and think that maybe society as a whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And the unfortunate reality is that in certain countries, it's very difficult to see that happening anytime soon. And the UK is one of those countries.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And so, as I said, before we started recording, like a lot of the work that I do is around people with eating disorders, people with messy relationships with food, people who are dieted and chronic dieters. And so much of the messaging, and you kind of touched on this already, but like so much of the messaging can then lead to people becoming like obsessive and so fearful of food, or it can then lead to more of, like shame around food, and then people doing the behaviors that actually we're trying to get people to stop. So how, like, it's a really difficult thing, as you alluded to earlier, but like, how do you think they could be doing better in the kind of public policy around nutrition?
Well, I think that is maybe an intractable problem. The bottom line is we need to change the food environment. In order to change the food environment, we have to have hard conversations about the characteristics of the food being consumed at a population level that over the long term predispose people to an increased risk of cardiometabolic disease. Denying that there is that relationship is more problematic than any rhetoric around removing advertising on the tube, or zoning limits for fast food restaurants around schools, or any of these interventions where we expressly talk about food and the characteristics of the foods themselves. So I think what we really have to do is come back to, this is maybe one hangover from my legal career, but a proportionality test. And we need to weigh, is the proportional a kind of weight of implementing interventions that expressly target food and the food environment outweigh the potential for a few accepted individuals within that environment to be negatively impacted by the rhetoric of that. And I would argue that the proportionality is certainly in favor of action, at the level of industry and at the level of food and at the level of the food environment. But I think that we can certainly do far better with the rhetoric that comes out the back end about these campaigns. And, a recent example of that is, the report from the chief medical officer. And the report in and of itself was overall really excellent. But there was one line in it, where they said, we need to ban snacking for kids on public transport.
Yeah.
And that one line scuppered the whole report, sank the whole thing, because that is, well, one, it's nonsense. How it made it into the final draft, I don't know. And I certainly know from having a conversation with a couple of people that had more insight into the behind the scenes working, that people that were involved were just banging their head against the wall, because it meant that the Daily Mail and everything else grabs it and is like, nanny state is going to stop you from snacking and blah, blah, blah. And then other reports that come out, or other measures that come out, still use this rhetoric of things like, childhood obesity. And it's just like, the utility of the rhetoric when the campaign comes out, I question. If it has to be part of the behind the scenes negotiations to get people in politics or otherwise to listen, fine. But does it have to be part of the final rhetoric of a campaign that's targeting a specific aspect of the food environment? I question the utility of that. So I think that absolutely we, broadly speaking, can do a way better job of cleaning up and improving the language and the semantics of how these questions are framed to the public, and how these policy interventions come into the public realm. But fundamentally, those policies themselves are absolutely going to have to be focused on food. And we're going to have to talk about food. And we're going to have to talk about the food environment. And there's no easy way around that. And like I said, the proportionality of doing those high-level kind of population-wide interventions outweighs the potential for that kind of campaign or rhetoric to be triggering in a small subset.
Yeah,
and I think that's a reality of so much of what we do with public health. It's just, when it comes to nutrition, there's just a lot more emotion loaded into that conversation. But we do it with loads of other things. We do it with cigarette smoking, no one bats an eyelid. We do it with alcohol, no one bats an eyelid. There's a lot of elements of public health generally where this balance is there, and it's just not contentious. But there's an extra emotional layer when it comes to food, and that obviously creates for a very emotive discourse that can be a problem.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think part of that probably comes out of so much of the focus being on choices and the the eradication of bringing in socioeconomics and all of those other factors that you talked about as being there, as if a lot of the time as if they're not even a thing and they just don't even get a look in. And so I think that can make it a lot more loaded in terms of how it feels for an individual than it would otherwise be if, as you say, the rhetoric around it was better.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, the rhetoric can be improved. And I think there's a broad acceptance now that the rhetoric can be improved, but these things are going to be slow to implement. And the problem, certainly within the public health realm, is that they're going to be slow to implement because there are so many different stakeholders at the table. Yeah. So it's easy for us as nutrition professionals to sit around and say, oh my God, we have all this evidence for the effects of stigma, or we have these evidence for the effects of whatever, or behavior change. And it's very easy for us to view, as humans do, the problem merely through our own lens. The conversation takes on an entirely different complexion when there are multiple stakeholders at the table who aren't an expert in your discipline, but have their experience from their own discipline. And that's the lens through which they're looking at it. And that is a very, very difficult place to be, to try and bring in policy that reflects everything. And again, I think the recent Cancer Research UK example is probably quite a poignant example of that, because from their perspective, this was about raising awareness. They needed to make people aware, and awareness is good because people will change their behaviors once they're aware. And totally divorced from the evidence about the effectiveness of positive versus negative messaging on behavior change, totally ignorant of the evidence they weren't ignorant of it, they were told about it, they just chose to ignore it, and that's the problem. Yeah.
And I also think the fact that it's not just the public health messaging, it's then all of the diet messaging and the blogs and the Instagram and all of that that's giving this other message that's encouraging people to be doing very problematic behaviors that's happening alongside this, that then colors how someone thinks about public health messaging. Right, exactly. And I think, social media is toxic for the most part. The influence that it has is enormously disproportionate to the level of expertise that is there. And because we are in the information age, there are no easy answers to the avenues through which people can receive misinformation now. I don't think social media does anything really that adds to this conversation in particular that we're having. Social media, I think, more than anything is, and this is where we get more disconnect in the conversation, because on the one hand, you have, the broader kind of anti-diet and non-diet movement and the Haze movement and otherwise. But, on social media, that gets taken to this other ether where you have skinny nutritionists who've never had to diet screaming diets don't work at everyone. And so you get this massive disconnect between the rhetoric on social media, which is really artificially inflated in favor of one type of kind of rhetoric, versus then what we see at a public health level. And it looks like there's this massive discord, but in fact, the discord is really not about the nitty gritty of what's happening on the ground. The discord is about the perception that people get of the weight of these conversations because they're exposed to it through things like social media. Yeah. So look, the final thing I want to ask is, I see you're joining Sigma Nutrition as their research communication officer.
Yes.
So what are you going to be doing there? What's that role entail?
So nutrition being as fractured as it is, Danny has done such a great job over the years of cultivating a great brand in Sigma, in being objective, in being committed to science-based discourse. Obviously, the podcast as a vehicle to largely interview academics has been such a huge part of that. And I think what we really want to work on is trying to provide a resource to people in the public, that if there's, a kind of a position stand on a particular issue, that it's coming from a place of objectivity. It's not coming from a belief system place. That we're putting out good information, we're tackling some of the big questions in nutrition science and putting together very kind of reasoned and objective critiques of the evidence that's there to be able to try and start to kind of come to some conclusions. And because, I think that the really important thing is Sigma's independence in all of these conversations and the trust that people have in it. So yeah, we have a couple of ideas for how we'll start to communicate content. Nothing like set in stone yet. We're brainstorming, but very excited for how that content will translate, and I'm very confident that we're going to do a really great job of providing a resource that people can really trust. Yeah. And trust that it's objective, and trust that it's not belief system driven, and trust that it's truly science based.
Nice. And so is that what you would want to be doing as a career after the PhD? Like what's your real passion area?
So it's interesting. I came into the PhD with the plan A very loosely being I'd love to get into research and continue and have a career in research and science, in nutrition, obviously. But I'm also realistic about how little funding there is in nutrition science. It's scary / appalling that such a topic that we talk about every single day and is on everyone's lips, it has zero funding, really, relative to other scientific disciplines. Yeah. And
even within other scientific disciplines, there is the whole publish or perish problem.
Perish thing, and yeah. I'm kind of live to those issues, and I don't want to, end up just slogging through trying to get funding when I could be contributing to nutrition science in a different way. And I love the communication aspect. I love the public facing aspect and trying to help steer a more moderate conversation. And so, to be honest, the plan B, that's not really a B, but more of an A2 could very well be that I simply finish the PhD and kind of pursue more of that kind of private, kind of more entrepreneurial, avenues in, broadly speaking, science kind of communication for nutrition.
Okay, nice. Well, look, you have a skill at being able to do that. So yeah, I wish you all the best.
Thanks very much, Chris. Cheers.
Look, thank you for coming on the show. I mean, where should people go if they want to find out more about you?
At the nutritional_advocate on Instagram. And this is going to be a few weeks before it comes out, right? Yeah. So by the time this comes out, my own website will be live, and I guess we can just link to it in the show notes then.
Okay, perfect. And yeah, as I said at the beginning, Cut Through Nutrition, I highly recommend people check out that podcast as well.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris.
All right. Thanks for coming on.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.